Okay, welcome to the On Your Side podcast. I'm Gary Harper.
And I'm Susan Campbell.
Today we're talking about a topic that is one of my two favorite topics. My first one is money. Love to talk about money.
Oh, wait, I thought cars was on there too.
Well, that would be number 3.
Okay.
But today we're talking about real estate. I love talking about real estate.
Before we jump in, though, we have to tell people where we are.
I feel a little out of my element, right? Because we're in our temporary podcast booth. Tell everybody a little bit what we're doing.
Yeah, so we are going through a big renovation. If you've watched our podcast, you might have noticed maybe that our podcast studio upstairs could have used a little love.
A little updating.
So it's getting that updating right now. So we are in this temporary space and just figuring it out.
And you went upstairs to see the new one. It's in progress. How does it look?
It's going to look good. It's going to look cool. It's a totally different setup. We're going to be able to interact with each other a little bit better and with our guests. And it'll be really cool when it's ready to go.
Yeah, I'm
hopefully
excited.
soon.
I'm excited about that. I think, the next podcast we do will probably be in our new digs.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. So let's talk real estate.
Let's do it.
There was what I would consider, and I think a lot of people consider, a landmark decision that came down recently. It was an antitrust lawsuit, and it was against the NAR, National Association of Realtors, and
several brokerages and other
several
companies.
brokerages. The NAR, they're going to have to come up with a $1.8 billion.
Billion with a B.
With a B. Over inflated commissions when it comes to realtors. This is a huge story, and I don't think a lot of people are paying attention to it.
It's a big deal to talk about. This is what the jury found, and we just really wanted to kind of dive in and get a little bit more depth and more context to this story because, you see the headline, $1.8 billion.
Yeah.
What in the world does that actually mean?
What is that going to mean for home buyers and home sellers? For that, we're going to get some information, hopefully, from Katrina Barrett. She owns Walt Danley Local Luxury here in the Valley. How are you doing today, Katrina?
Doing great.
Hey, thanks for being on the On Your Side podcast. Tell us a little bit, and our listeners, tell us a little bit about this lawsuit and effectively what will it mean?
Yeah, definitely. So what the article is suggesting is exactly that the realtors were overcompensated. But the unfortunate part of the ruling is it's suggesting to sellers that they should not be compensating a buyer's agent. This compounds with two very major issues if this is the direction that the real estate industry takes from this ruling. The first implication would be if buyers' agents are not compensated, then buyers by definition are going to be coming direct. A lister has a relationship with a seller. They are signing an agreement in a listing agreement to represent their interests. If buyers that they have never met before are now coming forward and they're being asked to represent them in a dual agency, this opens up all kinds of areas for liability because it is very difficult to be a neutral fiduciary between two parties when your interest lies in representing the seller.
So let's take baby steps with this because it's a huge issue, and I just want to make sure our listeners are understanding correctly because this is going to have a huge impact on the real estate industry. So let's just start out, and many people already know, when you sell your home, there is a split on the commission. Usually 3% of the sale goes to the seller's agent, the other 3% goes to the buyer's agent. The buyer's agent who actually bought the buyer to the table. So there's a 6% split there. If you have a $500,000 home, you're going to have to give up as a homeowner $30,000 in commission. That's a lot of money. So with this new decision, what happens now? Does this mean that it's only going to be 3%? What does that mean? Break it down.
Yes. So two things in there. Number one, in Arizona, there are no set standards of commissions, and actually nationally, but all commissions are negotiated. So to say that there's 3% on each side, if you have a $50 million listing, do you need to make 3%? You might offer that seller 1%. Conversely, if you have a very tricky sale, very difficult entries in the $100,000 range, you might deserve 10% just on the listing side. So all commissions are negotiated. Secondarily, what that article is suggesting is that a buyer should be paying their commissions directly. Well, this brings up a big issue with affordable housing. The NAR's top goal right now is to work on affordable housing across the country. If a buyer is strapped paying very, very high percentage for loans right now, they very often do not have cash on the sidelines to be able to compensate a buyer broker. So if they are unable to compensate a buyer broker, you are deleting from the affordable housing level the right of representation. That's a huge issue.
So, jump in here.
Well, I want to go back. Buying a house is not something that most people do so many times in their life, right? It happens maybe a handful of times. And so even if you've done it once or twice before, it still is an unfamiliar process when you're going through this. How does somebody actually negotiate a rate with their agent? I don't remember. I did that one time on one transaction, and I did not do that the other time that I bought a house.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, they don't buy houses a lot, so they don't know that it is negotiable.
Yeah.
And
So give us the advice. How would a potential client, a home seller or home buyer do that? How do we start the negotiation?
So currently, really, the commissions are set by the seller because currently the seller is volunteering to pay the 3% or 2% or 1% to the buyer's agent. Now, if you think about this logically, if you're a seller and you really want to sell your house, if you offer very, very low incentive to a buyer's agent, you're actually hurting yourself. Take the hypothetical example of 3% to a buyer broker. If you were to offer 4%, would this, draw more buyers to your house? It should. Conversely, if you're only offering 1%, you're telling that buyer broker, I don't value you very much. I don't think that you're worth it to bring buyers to my home. And therefore, you'll be shown less often. So if you're a home that's very, very easy to sell and there's a lot of demand, you can absolutely negotiate a lower commission. If you're a difficult to sell home, you should be offering a very high commission to kind of incentivize someone to come and show and sell your home.
What makes it very difficult to sell property? Who are people who are going to have to pay a premium for to get realtors in their house?
Yeah, so obviously in areas of scarcity, such as here in the Valley, in Arcadia proper, for instance, there might only be 8 active homes at any time out of a plot of 400. That would be a very tight market, and there's a lot of demand in that market. If you had a brand new build in that area that was priced correctly, it's kind of going to sell itself. If you now jump to the depths of Maricopa and possibly have, a big reno house that needs a lot of work, someone who is going to have to come and put in time, effort, and money to make this house a livable and nice house, that's a difficult listing. There's a lot of active inventory, and there's work to be done by a buyer. 4/5 of buyers do use a loan, and with rates so high right now, they don't have a lot of cash to be able to make repairs. So the homes that need a lot of work are kind of the most difficult to sell right now.
In your experience, do buyers ever pay their own realtor?
It's a thinly practiced. In the highest end, it happens. Here's how. If I had a $10 million house and I said, I want to net $10 million, then it is up to the buyer's agent and the seller's agent to negotiate a contract high enough with that buyer that it loops in a commission for those agents. So hypothetically, if that were a situation where the seller has told the listing agent, look, I want to net $10 million. You sell it for more than that, and you guys can work out what the fee is. This does happen in the highest end. This doesn't happen in the lower end because they don't have the cash on the sideline. By putting it on the seller side, that commission is wrapped into their loan. When you put it on the buyer to pay their own buyer broker, they're coming up with that $30,000 example in cash. They don't have that cash. Therefore, it's excluding them from having representation because they don't have the option to pay it.
So let's bring it back down to earth because we can't afford a $10 million house. And I don't know if a lot
You
of people
can't?
can.
Oh, I thought you could on your reporter salary.
$8 million. I can't go as high as $10 million. So, but let's bring it back down to a normal priced house. And I want to make sure our listeners understand This hasn't really gone into effect yet because I believe the NAR is going to appeal this, but it's on the forefront. So again, for a home seller and a home buyer, if this does take place, the home buyer, the fear is for real estate agents is that they're not going to want a buyer's agent or a buyer broker, and they'll just team up with the seller's agent. That way, the sellers won't have to pay so much. Is that correct?
That is correct. They're trying to reduce the price that a seller is paying and put representation as a buyer's right, but as a buyer's price.
I'm going to throw you a softball now because I don't think we've quite touched on it. Why does a buyer need somebody in their corner that's not associated with the seller?
Absolutely. That's a great point to touch on. So as a seller, if you're representing a seller, you obviously have some level of relationship with this individual. You care for their life. You care for their outcome. If you are to also represent the buyer, you're actually fighting for that seller to get every dollar possible. As a buyer, to have representation, number one, you want to be clear that you're getting all of the deficiencies of the home. You're having a very good inspection and you know exactly what you're buying. Nothing's being covered up. Nothing's being, illy disclosed. This is where lawsuits happen. Number two, a buyer is going to fight, a buyer's representation, a buyer's agent is going to fight to get that price as low as possible for that buyer. If you're only using the seller side agent, they're only really fighting for what is the maximum level that this buyer will pay where we can cross the finish line. Where if you have dual agency, two brokers on either side, you've got a buyer fighting to get it lower and telling the agent as to why, and you've got a seller trying to defend why the house is worth more. Historically, the power is kind of with the buyer. Unless the house is very easy to sell, then they're dependent on that buyer to cross the finish line. So truly, what is a house worth? It's worth what a buyer will pay for it, but it's also worth that buyer having the correct representation to educate, teach, and kind of attack a seller as to why it needs to be lower than their list price.
Can you understand why some home buyers feel like they have been taken advantage of and where the jury came up with this ruling?
Yes. So what they're thinking is that there's conspiring it within brokerages that if I'm a buyer's agent, I'm only going to show a listing that has 3%. So that buyer is actually missing seeing a lot of the inventory out there because that buyer's agent wants to be fairly compensated. That's kind of the root of the problem. Additionally, a seller is feeling unjust that they're paying two sides when really half of that is to a buyer. I think as a seller, the most important thing to think about is the net. What do I need to get out of this in my pocket? And then work backwards as to what you can pay someone based on what you need to get in the pocket. I will say to sellers, by paying an agent more, you will likely end up with a higher sales price. They are more incentivized to sell your house for more. If you're paying them very little and that buyer catches interest in any other home that is paying them more, they're no longer motivated to keep you in the deal.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground on this. I think it's important for everybody to realize this is not taking place right now, but it might down the road.
The jury ruling happened.
It did happen, right? But now we're in this appeals stage, and that's going to be dragged out forever. So, I mean, no changes, dramatic changes in the foreseeable future, but it could be huge when this is finalized.
But I also think there is information. I mean, when consumers get information, that becomes power, and people are feeling a little bit more powerful in maybe the buying process, in the selling process, and able to come to their real estate professional with extra information and say, hey, I want to negotiate with you. Yeah. I didn't know before this that I could, so let's talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like I said, we covered a lot of ground. Katrina, thanks so much for being on the On Your Side podcast. Is there a website or anything if people want to find out more about you or maybe your real estate?
Yeah, Local Luxury RE. It is worth, in closing, mentioning that this case doesn't actually change current rulings. Commissions are negotiated already. All this is doing is kind of creating a fine. It is not actually repealing or replacing any current standards or rules. It is opening a buyer and a seller's eyes. And I think the best thing the industry could do is just create further transparency, because as you said, most buyers only do this once, twice, 3 times in their life. And so really there needs to be more education and more transparency around what is being paid, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people are being compensated incorrectly. They just need to be informed.
All right. Well, thanks so much for being on the On Your Side podcast. I think we have informed our listeners. Thanks again, Katrina. The On Your Side podcast is produced by Brad Denny. Our audio engineer and editor is Todd Martin. Segment producer is Colin Stanton. And I'm Gary Harper.
And I'm Susan Campbell. If you have a problem you can't resolve, maybe we can. Send us a message through azfamily.com or our AZ Family mobile app. Look for the On Your Side section and leave us a message. Thanks so much for listening to the On Your Side podcast. And if you like it, leave us a review. We'll see you next week.
On Your Side is on Good Morning Arizona every weekday morning at 6:45 and 7 o'clock, and every weekday evening on Good Evening Arizona at 4 and 5 o'clock. You can also catch it on Arizona's Family News at 9 on 3TV every weeknight.